You'll notice we have 2 grazing presentations in line. The next one is going to be another good one. But the reason that is, in my opinion, I think is because grazing is one of the most important, livestock grazing is one of the most important things we can talk about. That's why, one of the biggest reasons it's different out here. And that cow can be a tremendous tool to improve habitat. It can also be a tool to damage habitat. So it's really important. And our next presentation is Livestock and Grazing Management in Trans-Pecos, Texas, by the esteemed Dr. Bonnie Warnock. She grew up on a ranch in the Trans-Pecos where her family's been ranching since the 1890s. She developed a passion for the ranching industry, nature, and the outdoors as a young child, which led her to pursue an education in range science, range, and wildlife management and soils to support her interest to how to be the best steward possible on working agricultural landscapes. Getting a BS and MS at Sul Ross and a PhD at A&M. Dr. Warnock returned to Sul Ross as a faculty member in 2001, where she is currently a professor, the Clint Josie Endowed Chair for Sustainable Ranch Management and the Dean of the College of Agricultural Life and Physical Sciences. She's busy. Her teaching now focuses on undergraduate classes in the Sustainable Ranch Management program at Sul Ross. She believes in active and experimental learning and works hard to engage her students. By the way, this is actually her biography. This is going to be her book that she wrote for herself. I'm just kidding. She has been recognized at Sul Ross regionally and nationally for teaching. Bonnie's research focused on grassland and riparian restoration on working landscapes, and through this has been recognized by the Society of Ecological Restoration with the Excellence in the Ecological Restoration Award. She is not currently engaged in research, as she now spends time on administering the College of Agricultural Life and Physical Sciences and providing support for students, faculty, and staff with the diverse academic programs in the college. In addition to her academic duties, Bonnie and her husband, Seth Warnock, are active in production agriculture, including ranching on their own place.
All right, so I'll try to figure out the remote. And so they asked me to speak a little bit about grazing management. And when you're looking at the slides, you're going to see slides that look really, really good, and you're going to see some slides that look really, really bad. So my husband likes to say that above average rainfall makes good ranch managers out of everybody. So when we're talking about grazing, I'm going to kind of focus on some different aspects. But first, we're really talking, and I know there's a bunch of words on this, but we're talking about energy flow. Okay, so really and truly, in a lot of ways, when you're managing a landscape, doesn't matter where, you're basically trying to take sunlight energy and you're trying to turn it into dollars in your pocket. That's basically what we're trying to do. You know, ranching is a business. You know, maybe you got a couple of cows that you like to look at for yard art, but in general, we're looking at it as a business. So when we talk about this, we've got the sunlight, and then basically we have plants, call them producers. They're capturing that sunlight energy. They're going to basically take inorganic molecules and they're going to turn it into organic molecules. And then we're going to have consumers. And so consumers are basically going to be eating those producers. So the things that are plants that basically capture that sunlight energy, then we're going to have consumers. Consumers are going to ingest energy and nutrients from other living organisms. So they're going to eat something else that's alive. So we have herbivores. They're primary consumers. They're going to eat the producers. So animals that eat plants. Then we're going to have secondary, which are basically animals that are going to eat your primary consumer. So something that's going to eat an herbivore. And then you have tertiary, which are basically going to be sometimes eating herbivores, but they may also be eating other carnivores. So if you think about wolves are going to eat coyotes. So those are usually our top level predators. So we are kind of creating this food web. And then we have decomposers and scavengers that primarily are going to ingest energy and nutrients from dead material. So when we look at that, we're going to have all of these, I'm going to call them players in the food web. And this goes from microorganisms in the soil that we can't even see, and you've got this really complex soil food web all the way up through, things that we look at. A lot of our big charismatic species, you think pronghorn, you think coyotes, you think mountain lions, we're looking at those. They're about on the same scale we are. But we're really looking at how do we get that energy to flow through those systems, and how do we work within that system to make sure that we're preserving and enhancing that system while we're grazing and basically utilizing these landscapes. So we are, as humans, what's called a keystone species. A keystone species is one that is going to have a much larger impact on the ecosystem than their size would presume that they have. So I've got some other examples. Prairie dog is a keystone species. Little bitty animal, has a really big impact. Beavers are another, harvester ants. So you basically have these species that can really manipulate an ecosystem. They can basically have an outsized impact. So when we, as humans, a lot of times we like to remove ourselves from the natural system. Well, if you're ranching, you are a part of that natural system. The decisions that you're making are basically going to be manipulating that system. And so you should really think about yourself as how you're changing the system and all of the cascading effects that one decision to keep one more cow or to sell one cow is actually going to have on that larger system. And so really putting yourself in that mindset, I think, is important if you're going to be a good grazing manager. So there are 4 kind of basic fundamentals of good grazing management that you're going to have to think about. So the first is kind and class of livestock, and we're going to go into each of these in detail. So what are you selecting as your herbivore? What are you going to put out there? What kind? So are you going to do sheep, goats, horses, cows, llamas? And then class or breed. What are you going to pick? Do you want Herefords? Do you want Angus? Do you want stockers? Do you want mama cows? What and how are you going to select for that? And then stocking rate. Wayne talked about this. I'll talk about it a little more. That's really, really important out here. And then seasonal distribution. Where are they in what seasons? We've talked about we've got a monsoon season out here. So where are you grazing during the monsoon? Where are you grazing during the dormant season? And spatial distribution. How are you making sure you're not overgrazing in one spot and you have no cattle in another spot? So an animal unit, and Wayne mentioned this, is based on a 1,000-pound cow. So it's a measure, it's a standardized unit of forage, basically, that a hypothetical 1,000-pound cow is going to eat, 9,490 pounds. Now, let me tell you this, as a rancher, I don't remember that number. You know what? I just rounded up 10,000 pounds. It's a lot easier to do the math that way. So that's basically what this kind of standardized unit that we do everything on. But you need to remember that your cows are not the only thing out there eating plants. So we have what's called an animal unit equivalent. So if we look out there and we say, hey, I've got prairie dogs, 250 prairie dogs eats the same thing as one cow. So you can basically get an idea. Mule deer, 5.3 mule deer equal one cow. A lot of people worry about desert termites, grasshoppers, and things like that. About 10 billion termites equals one cow. Grasshoppers, depending on how big they are, 527 to 1898. All this is kind of weird math, but so you look at that and you can say there's other stuff eating that. But you'll also see that a bull is 1.4 animal units. That bull is going to weigh a lot more than those cows are, that bull's going to eat a lot more than those cows are. A ranch horse, 1.1. I just started doing math on bucking horses. We have a ranch at Sierra Blanca, the university does, and we have rodeo stock. So you put one of those big bucking horses out there, you're like, oh, I pretty much figure one bucking horse is equal to 2 cows. So you got to think about what you have out there besides cows. And this is not to tell anyone here that you ought to go out and kill all the rest of that stuff so you can have more cows. My family's been ranching out here a long time, and guess what? That's what everybody started out with. So there are, I'm going to call them old rancher tales. There are old rancher tales, basically folks sitting up in the wolf camp hills killing 200 pronghorn a day. Because guess what? Those pronghorn are eating what my cows are eating, so let's get rid of them, you know? Prairie dogs, those damn prairie dogs eating all that stuff my cows are eating, let's kill all the prairie dogs. That basically means you're working against Mother Nature, not with Mother Nature. You need to realize that you're part of the system, and it's better to plan long-term as part of the system rather than basically saying, I want to kill any other herbivore in the entire system, because you really break the system then. So, talked a little bit about cattle breed, cattle size. So there is, you know, Wayne showed you some scary math. If you don't want to do the scary math, the University of Wyoming Extension has the best, I think, easy to use calculator where you can just put stuff in. So it's the University of Wyoming Extension, Ranch Tools, their stocking tool. If you go to that website, you're just plugging in numbers. And there's 3 calculators on there, so depending on what data you have, you can basically plug that in and really get a good idea of your stocking rate. But you can also compare sizes of animals. So if we do a scenario, and we're going to say, all right, we have one section, 1 square mile, 640 acres. If our average production is 500 pounds per acre, and we're going to run a cow-calf operation for 12 months, and we plan to utilize 25% of our forage, well, let's compare a 1,000-pound cow and a 1,200-pound cow. So if we have 1,200-pound cows, we're going to have 7 head. So we're going to be able to run 7 head for 12 months. Now, we had a question earlier about bigger cow, bigger calf. So in the 1980s, all of us cattle producers basically had this idea that if you've got a bigger cow, you're going to sell a bigger calf. It's logical, right? The bigger you are, the bigger your kid, right? So how many of you looking around notice people's children? Are their children all the same size that they are? No, you have a wide variation. Well, what we've been seeing with the cattle industry with this move to larger and larger and larger frame sizes is that big cows do not wean off significantly bigger calves. You get a little bit, but you don't get a lot. So what you're going to see up here is based on the industry kind of average. So if you've got a 1,000-pound mama cow, you're going to be able to sell a 450-pound calf. If you got a 1,200-pound cow, you're going to be able to sell a 475-pound calf. So you get a little bit of a larger wean size, but you don't get a lot. And so what we're seeing now in the cattle industry is there's now a big push to try to go back to smaller cattle because this is how the math works. So you get a 1,200-pound cow. We're just going to assume you're a fantastic manager and you have 100% calf crock. That's not the real world, but we're doing some hypothetical math. So with that, your gross income off of that area is $6,650. If you have smaller cows, you're going to be able to have 1 more cow on that section. Going to wean off calves that are a little bit smaller, but your gross income is more. So smaller cows tend to generate more revenue than bigger cows do. And the drier it is, the more true this becomes, because a lot of times those little cows can hustle a little bit better than a big cow. And then let's talk about stockers. So let's say so stockers are teenage cows, okay? So basically they're yearlings. And so let's say we are gonna look at 700 pounds. We're gonna buy them at 600, sell them at 800. So we're gonna just use the average weight for this calculation. So if we basically say, again, we're selling them at $2 a pound, we're gonna make $14,000, twice what we could with a mama cow operation. So why isn't everybody running stockers? I mean, look at that money. So if you own a rental house, do you want to rent to an established couple that maybe has, a kid? Or do you want to rent to a whole bunch of college boys? Okay, well, stockers are the same thing. You put them out there, they're looking for a hole, they're running around, they basically get in little groups, they're doing all kinds of things. Your fences have to be about 5 times better to run stockers than they do to mama cows. Mama cows walk up and they're like, oh, well, there's a hole there. Well, that's a lot of work. So they gotta be really sure to feed before they're gonna get out. So you gotta have a lot more infrastructure. And the other thing with stockers, it's also kind of like kindergarten. If there's one little germ, it's going to go through everybody. So it takes more work when you're looking at running stockers. So this is gross income, it's not net. So you're going to have to put more money a lot of times into those stockers or into the infrastructure to be able to do this. So, but you're making those decisions as a manager. And so it's looking at how much grass do you have, what your cow should look like, and then how much money are you going to make. So got a couple of pictures here. So Wayne said not to name your cow, so I'm going to break that rule. So the one on the left or right, anyway, sorry, I'm directionally challenged. So there's a cow and calf. This is a drought, or it was a very dry winter. Dry year, so this is right at the 1st of July. We hadn't had a monsoon. So this cow, she's in pretty good body condition. She hasn't shed off all her hair yet, but she's just had that little calf, and she's looking pretty dang good. When we're talking about breeds out here, heterozygosity is the only free thing in the cattle industry. So that little cow up there, that's not a show cow. That cow basically is so she's Brangus, Limousin, Hereford, going back to basically an F1 cross. So lots of different breeds. She's not like a super attractive cow. If I took her to Houston, everybody would probably laugh at me. But that little cow right there has a calf every year. She weighs just right at 1,050 pounds. Her mother got killed by lightning with a calf on her side when she was 19 years old. So very, very locally adapted. We've been breeding those cows for a long time in this area. So, and that's great. That's great for marathon. That cow would not do very well in Presidio. You take her to South County, she'd fall apart. So we've got a bull there in the other picture. So this is some of the stuff that we select for out here. So one, you're looking at legs. Those cows have got to be able to cover some country. So you got to have good, solid legs underneath your cow. You want a flat back. That flat back really helps you with looking at overall just kind of fitness, body condition, nice round butt. That's where all the steaks are. And the other thing, and you'll see it in this cow and that bull, you want a big, wide cow because that's where their rumen is. So they're eating grass. They got to be able to intake a bunch of lower quality forage to be able to create enough energy. So you want them to have a big gut. They need to have a big rumen. They need to have enough space in there to be able to do that. So a lot of times you're selecting for hybrid cattle that are going to be able to have those characteristics where they can travel, and then basically a big kind of wide gut. One of the trends we're seeing out here in the cattle industry is breeding with Corriente cattle and bringing in what are called criollo cattle. Y'all may not have heard of that. That's a breed in Mexico that is very small, and they will actually eat a lot more browse. So if you're looking at going into South County, you'd be looking at a very different cow than this. And that's where you really start seeing that Corriente and criollo influence. So pick your livestock for your local area. If you've got somebody who's been ranching for a long time, go see if you can buy some heifers or bull off of that rancher. So, stocking rate. We talked about this a little, but monitor your vegetation. And then be realistic. It's not going to rain every year. It's not going to be a good year every year. In fact, most years are going to be kind of a bad year. So a low to moderate stocking rate is best. And then do the math. This is a business. You need to treat it like it's a business. And the fastest way to grow broke in ranching is buying hay. Absolutely. You're buying grass from somebody else. They've got a lot of inputs. We're out here in the middle of nowhere. But the other thing that you need to think about, and in some ways this goes back to naming your cows, you're dealing with a living system. So how many of you, if you had a dog for 19 years, if you got an animal for 19 years, are you going to get attached to it? Probably. If you see it once a week. If you have an animal for 10 years, are you going to get attached to it? Yeah, so it can be easy to get attached to your livestock. You've got them there, you've got them for a long time. You got a cow that's one of your top performers. It is an emotional business. And we get into a lot of problems because it's a hard decision. If you've made a decision to put a pet down, you know how hard that decision is. Well, if you've got a cow that you basically raised from a calf, it's been around for 10 years, you've had a great calf on the ground every year from that cow, and you got to basically make a decision to put it on a truck and send it to slaughter. It's the same decision. So you have to understand that emotions and compassion are going to come into play in ranching. And so when you're thinking about setting that stocking rate, it's a lot easier to be very conservative, where you can weather hard times with those animals that you're keeping for a long time, rather than basically having to sell out on a regular basis. The other thing that we see with cattle is on your balance sheet, they basically go in as a capital investment. So when we've got a cow, it's kind of like having a bond. It goes in the same place on your financial sheet. So it can be hard to sell a bond early because you're going to take a financial hit. Same thing on a cow. You sell a cow early, you're taking a financial hit. So you have to really think about this idea of long-term investment with a cow-calf versus short-term investment with a stalker. So a stalker, it's basically like you're kind of buying and selling stocks. You know, you buy low, sell high. Hope you make money and make some money on it. So, and then there's less time to get emotionally involved with those animals. So you got to really think about how you're setting your stocking rate and how it interacts with those animals. So 25% is best, okay? So if you do the math, you're like, oh my gosh, but if I use 50%, I could have 14 cows. I can have twice as many cows if I use 50%. But again, you know, you're gonna have to sell out whenever you hit a drought. So doing that 25%, you have a built-in buffer for drought years. So it makes it a lot easier to manage. You also have built-in forage for wildlife. Wildlife have become really an economic driver on a lot of ranches, so you're getting that forage. You also have, and this is a new buzzword now, You're basically creating ecosystem services. And so this is the newest term for all this. So those plants are doing other things other than just being out there for grazing. So you're leaving that, you're gonna actually improve your grass health. Your grass needs to grow roots. It needs to be able to provide shade for juveniles coming up. It needs to be able to put seeds out there so you can maintain a healthy ecosystem. It's gonna build soil organic matter. The more soil organic matter you have, the more water filtration you have, the more water storage you have. So you're basically gonna be able to capture more of the rain that you're gonna be getting. Another thing is view sheds. You know, what we know about the Trans-Pecos is it's really nice to look at. You know, there's a lot of tourists that come out, and when you're looking at the actual valuation of your property, the prettier it is, the more it's worth. Again, you're adding that into your balance sheet as a business. And if you leave grass, you leave good native vegetation, it really helps you with invasive and undesirable species. So you're not gonna be spending money on brush control if you have good grass. You do good grazing, you can actually, for example, kill prickly pear just by leaving enough grass, because that grass gets around the prickly pear and basically it'll get a fungal infection and die if you've got all that grass around the prickly pear. So that's going to create more long-term financial success and more stability across your operation. So I said this before, fastest way to go broke is buying hay. So supplemental feed. As a rancher, I feel strongly that your goal should be no supplemental feed, no energy, no carbs, no protein. Put minerals out there. We know minerals can be deficient based on our soil, but that should be the gold standard, because you're not spending money for somebody else to grow feed for you to haul it halfway across the United States to feed to your livestock. Now, you cannot do that every year, but that should be your goal. So you can use supplement. You should use it enough for training. So I'm a big thing on training your livestock. I really like it that I can go out in my pajamas and my little flat slippers and I can move my cows in 30 minutes by standing there yelling. So they're all trained. They come when I call. I can move them all. We were shipping calves the other day, and we had basically took about 45 minutes to move them all into a trap. The next morning we got up. It took us 15 minutes to get them all in the pen. So very low stress. So we use supplement for being able to train. So it's like training your dog. What do? You give them a treat. So same with the cows. The other thing you need to do is really think about life cycle needs. Where and when do your livestock need more energy? When do they need more protein? And how are you going to balance that with what you have on the ground? You should collect data on either fecal analysis or your standing crop. Know what your protein content is of that grass. One thing that I see is that we basically put out a lot more protein than our livestock actually need out here. Our grass tends to have a lot of protein in it. It cures really well. So send off a sample, figure out. And if you want to work with one of the big feed companies, they'll basically do it for you. Or work with the NRCS. They can really help you with where to send that off. So you know what your feed value is. Otherwise, you're just guessing. You're putting a bunch of protein out there. You may be paying money that you actually don't need for that. And then think about supplementing. You know, when cows are calving, they're starting to give milk, they're going to need more than they may need on a regular basis. But don't just put out supplement all year long. Really think about it. It's a humongous expense, so you need to be careful with how you do that. So spatial grazing distribution. So one of the big things I think is you need to really think about your operation as creating opportunities to manage. So if you just have, and this is a ranch that I grew up on, we basically had one big pasture. The cows just went out in the big pasture. You know, they did cow things. We gathered them twice a year. Worked them. The bulls stayed out with the cows all year long. And we just basically pulled them in. You basically marked and you shipped, and they were just out there. There's not a lot of opportunities to manage with that one big pasture, because you can either say, well, I need this many cows, or I need this many cows, or I need no cows, but you can't decide, well, I want the cows to not be in the draw. I want them to be out of the riparian area, and I want to be over here in the upland. Or I only want them to be in this spot when it's not pronghorn fawning, because this is my premier pronghorn fawning location. So that one big pasture, you don't have the opportunity to make those choices. So it's really thinking about creating opportunities to be able to make management decisions and apply management. So we create a lot of boundaries. So we put up fences. Those fences can basically be barbed wire, electric fence, basically a boundary. And then thinking about how do you design your pastures. So keep that in mind. Create focus areas, water, mineral. Manage focus areas. Where do you have shade? Where do you have cover? Where do you have food? And understand your basic animal behavior. So where are they going? So seasonal grazing distribution, that's rotational grazing. So thinking about where your cows are, when are you breeding, when are you calving. Really, a lot of times if you think about having a cow-calf herd and a stocker herd, you can really create a lot more opportunities for seasonal grazing. The other thing is what's left. How much vegetation do you leave after grazing, and how long is your rest period? Out here, your rest period is going to be, I think, more important than most of your other choices. So all of this can basically increase long-term productivity. If you leave more grass on the ground, you're going to have less grasshoppers, less termites, less invasive and undesirable plants. You're going to increase good things like dung beetles. You're going to increase water infiltration. So thinking about what you're leaving is really, really important. So long-term economics, you're leaving a good standing crop. It helps with drought proofing. So whenever you get rain, that rain's going to go in the ground. It helps with increased herd health, increased longevity of your cattle, increased daily weight gain. So it really builds on those economics as well. So in a lot of ways, if you're going to be a good grazing manager, you have to be able to adapt. You got to be able to change, and you got to be able to really make those changes based on what's happening on your ranch. And it doesn't need to be what your granddad did, and it doesn't have to be what your neighbor's doing. You got to make decisions for what's happening on your place. So observe, adjust, be open to making changes. If you want to try something, don't do it on the whole ranch. Do it on a little piece where it's safe to fail, and keep good records. And those records can just be pictures. That's all I've got. I know I'm running close to time, but so I don't know. Do we have time for questions? Okay.
We do.
Hey, so with the cost of fencing being, over 20,000 a mile, what do you think about virtual collars and their effectiveness?
So one of the things, virtual fencing is basically where I think most of y'all have seen where you basically buy a collar for your dog, and then you put this kind of geo-fence around your yard, and if the dog gets close to it, it gets zapped. It's the same thing for cattle. A lot of times it's your collar, your ear tag. Those can be successful if you work with animal behavior. The problem that we've seen is They basically put a virtual fence up. The cow walks up, gets shocked. That's bad. She kind of pulls off. She does that a couple of times. Well, she just learned that there's something there that she doesn't want to go up to. And then you move the fence. You basically get on your computer and like, okay, now I want them to graze this next part. Well, nobody told the cow that. Nobody communicated that in any effective way to that cow, that they're not going to get zapped there. So what you have to do if you're going to do that is basically give them visual cues. So this is something that I'd like to do research on, but you're still going to need a gate. So you want to move cows from one place to the other. Okay, and maybe this is going to look dumb, build a gate out in the middle of nowhere. And then you basically anchor your geofence off of the gate. Well, the gate's open, cows can go through the gate. The gate is closed, they don't go through the gate. That's something that they're familiar with. They understand gates. They've been raised with gates all their life. And then you can't just move the fence. So you have to decide where you want your permanent geofence. You put it up there, and then it's always going to be there. But basically, thinking that you can move it without telling the cows, they don't know that. They can't see that. There's a really classic biological experiment where they put a glass plate in a fish tank, and the fish, thump against the glass for a couple of days. Then you pull the glass out, and the fish never go across that invisible boundary. They learned that it was there. And so I think it's really going to be important as we go forward to really think about cattle and livestock behavior and how do we integrate that with technology, rather than just assuming that because we can move a fence on our computer that the cows are going to know that.
Dr. Warnock, to me, stocking rate is the backbone of grazing management, and it can be boiled down to supply and demand. So demand seems pretty easy to calculate. Why is it challenging to calculate supply, and how can a rancher calculate the supply?
So basically, supply is how much grass you're going to grow in a year. So in many ways, we have a system that's very unpredictable in West Texas. So you're trying to predict rainfall, and how much grass you're going to grow based on rainfall. That's really, really difficult to figure out. So one of the things that you absolutely need to do is you need to figure out how to actually inventory your vegetation. And you can go out and clip plots. That is really hard to do. One of, I think, the most successful ways that ranchers can do this is with pictures. And you can work with your local NRCS folks to kind of set this up. But you go out and you put down a plot, and then you take a picture of it, and then you clip it and you weigh it. And then you have a picture and you start putting them in a book. And you start saying, on my ranch, 1,000 pounds per acre looks like this picture. And 500 pounds per acre looks like this picture. And 200 pounds per acre looks like this picture. And you basically create a picture book. And so then you can go out on your ranch with your picture book, and you can basically start walking around and you can compare and you can say, all right, how many acres do I have out here that looks like 1,000 pounds? How many looks like 500 pounds? And then you can start doing those calculations, but you have to realize it's going to be very variable. So, you're looking at those pictures. So the bottom picture, that is a desert grassland that is halfway between Alpine and Terlingua. It doesn't look like that very often. So if you basically base your grazing on that, you're overestimating your supply. So going out every year, and I say multiple times a year, and basically figuring out what happens so hey, if I get an inch of rain that falls in 2 hours, this is the kind of response that I'm going to get from my grass. Then you're going to start really developing that idea of what happens on your place. And again, what happens on your place from one pasture to another pasture may be totally different. So you can't just say, hey, I'm going to use this one pasture in this one spot to figure out what's going on for the whole thing. So it takes some time and some investment of time to do that. And again, that goes back to good management, actually putting in the time to get the information to make good decisions. If you're managing your finances, if you're a good financial manager, you put the time in, you do the research. You don't just say, hey, I'm going to buy stock A because, hey, it sounds good. Well, if you don't do your good data on your supply, it's the same thing. And you can get into a lot of financial trouble really quickly if you don't do that.
Question. Toward the end of your speech, you were talking about the rest period for the grazing and benefit of that, and then you mentioned dung beetles, and are those beneficial, and how some of the manure management works out here?
Okay, so can you say the last part of that question again?
How the manure management and that kind of cover works out here.
So when you're looking at rest period, one of the things you want to look at is making sure that you give every grass plant, or I'm going to say our good species, what you want to manage for, time to regrow. So in the growing season, you're going to want to really maybe have rest periods in the growing season for all of your plants. So moving your cattle where during that growing season, there's time when there's not any grazing. So that's really important. The longer your rest period can be, the better off you're going to be. If you look at the Dixon Water Foundation, they've got it set up. It's a lot of infrastructure, but they've got it set up where they can basically have a rest period of 365 days. So they graze it, and then they're off for a year. On our place, we don't have that much infrastructure. So basically what we typically do is we try to move our cows every 2 weeks to every month. And so then we're giving staggered rest to the different pastures as we're moving stuff around. When you're looking at having a lot of cattle together, you're running one herd so you can rest stuff, you are going to get that manure accumulation in that area. And so having dung beetles, and dung beetles are one of my, a lot of people think it's crazy, but I really like dung beetles. I'm a soil scientist, and I like cows. So having basically a species that takes that manure and actually integrates it into the soil to improve the soil health is really positive. So I look at, making decisions, for example, on what type of parasiticide I buy. Well, I don't buy ivermectin because ivermectin kills dung beetles. I'm going to buy Cydectin. I know it's higher at the store, but I'm going to buy Cydectin because it does not create a toxic manure. So I'm going to spend a little bit more money because I feel like I'm going to get more soil productivity, and it's going to be a good investment in the long run. So really starting to think about all those little decisions really help, I think, bolster your overall ecosystem health.
Okay, rock, paper, scissors, just work. Just real quick, you talk about rest, the time of year for your rest. You try and, does that factor into your decisions, knowing when plants may be trying to send nutrients to their roots so they can stay strong?
Yes, so when you're looking at when to rest, and I said, during the growing season, it's really important to let every one of your, I'm going to call them your good plants, the plants you're managing for, they need to have time to rest so that they can basically grow that photosynthetic material, then send those nutrients down to their roots, build up roots so that they can, again, survive drought. And that's part of what I think of as drought proofing. If you have a really good root system on those plants, they're going to help with capturing rainwater, and they're going to live through the drought. And then you're going to be able to come out of that drought with a good grassland rather than having a lot of your plants die because you've been basically starving them to death during your good times.
Do you have any idea how long no grazing would affect your grass?
So one thing that we do know about grass is it has adapted with herbivory. So we've got a lot of different things eating your grass. And so you do see, if you do not graze at all over a period of time, your grass will actually start dying. It won't be as healthy. And so having some grazing is important. I don't know, and I haven't seen any research on that. So this is basically my gut feeling from being out here and just observing stuff. But if you have no grazing for 7 to 10 years, you're going to start seeing your grass actually taking a hit on that and not being as healthy as grass that you see that's grazed a little more frequently. And you can kind of think about that as mowing your yard. If you mow your yard correctly, it can actually support grass health. If you scalp it, you're going to kill it all. But then if you don't mow it at all, over time that grass is going to get diminished because it has adapted to grazing pressure.
So this is maybe too big of a question for the time we have left, but I'm just curious about, the livestock and grazing management and where, like, watershed management come together and just all the different, ranches out here, and is there a mechanism for them to, work together to, I guess, protect, the health of the watershed? Is that?
So one thing we know is, our ranches out here are historically and traditionally very large. And that makes watershed management a little bit easier because, for example, when we're talking about Terlingua Creek, one landowner owns 25% of the upper watershed. So you can work with one person, one company, and you can basically make really good decisions that are going to impact the whole rest of the watershed. So to me, actually encouraging and supporting our livestock industry and these large ranches helps with watershed health. Once you start subdividing and you start getting smaller and smaller acreages, to do meaningful work on a watershed scale becomes much more complicated. So when you see the big watershed initiatives that we have in Central Texas that have been really successful, they've got to work with a lot of people. Out here, Borderlands Research Institute, they can basically sit down with 3 people and they basically can have good management to protect an entire watershed. So, and the same with, some of our other groups. So if you have these big landowners that have good cattle grazing so that they can basically have income off of that property, it becomes easier to do good watershed management.
Perfect. Good. Thank you, Bonnie.